Hi. So tonight I'm going to talk about time travel. I participated in several different kinds of time travel programs. The first one I was brought in was a very early program. It was a program in which adults, as remote viewers, were sent back in time to merge with the minds of people who were living in the past, particularly those people who were living in Victorian England, London. We had very good records of them, and even sometimes we had people who were related to them who could actually merge with their minds because there was the DNA resonance. The reason why I was brought in was because people were getting lost back in time, and they needed someone to monitor them to see what was going on. One of the things that was happening was that if they stayed too long, slept, went to sleep, and did a full sleep cycle, they could wake up and have merged completely with the person and no longer remember who they were in the future. I was brought in because I'm very good as a telepath, and I could actually stay with them and jerk them back before we were going to lose them. So that was my job for a while. Eventually, that progressed, and there were machines that could take people back and forth in time. And I then ended up actually being on the chair and going into people's minds temporarily, because you can't spend a long time if you're on the chair. You need to have your own body living. You have to come back to it. But I spent a lot of time looking in the looking glass because I could remember what I saw in different timelines. I can still do that. I can still remember the different timelines and the changes as we've merged since, for me, since 2016, June 21st, when was the first time we had a big timeline change. And so what I could see in the looking glass was I could see markers, and there are different kinds of markers. Some would be that a bad guy snuck in and put in a marker. And then we would realize that that was going to lead to a very bad timeline that we would be on. And sometimes we could go back in time and put in a good marker to try to drive our subconscious, our universal unconscious, towards the right timeline. So for example, Baron Trump, the book by Ingersoll Lockwood, which was written back in time in the late 1800s, that is a marker that was placed to help Trump win. And it's nice that it was Baron. There was another marker, which a lot of people know about, which is the movie Back to the Future, where, you know, oh my God, Trump is president. But that was a marker that was humorous. Maybe it was used by the bad guys, but I have to tell you, I think everybody who was a good person just kind of warmed to it. I thought it was really great. The scariest part of timelines is when you have bad guys who are trying to change the timeline to suit them. And we had two different ones happening. We had the World Trade Center event. That was a timeline for the bad guys who run this planet. Every single way that they looked, the best future for them was if 9/11 happened. You can see their markers by the fact that they had the dollar bills, not just the more recent ones, which someone pointed out, but actually dollar bills back in the 60s also could be folded into such a way that you see the towers coming down. And it's interesting because we were starting to go through the birth pangs of our sun changing and our resonance field changing as we progress, which we do every 25, 26,000 years, we progress. And the assassination of John F. Kennedy was like a birth pang. And then the next contractions came, and they were Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. And we were actually still heading towards what we see as this changing for the better. But those were really crushing blows, but they were like contractions. And then all of a sudden the contractions stopped. And I looked to see when and how they stopped. And what I saw was 1970. And something in my head said, let me take a look at the World Trade Center. And sure enough, the World Trade Center in 1970 opened its doors. And it was the North Tower with the antenna on top. And there was silence after that. We had no more contractions, no more birth pangs going towards the right timeline. I suspect that's why we have so much happening now. We are right about now to have our Earth be born into a new dimension. And that's why all the violence, and that's why all the extreme two sides that have to come together, which they will come together when we finally actually get there and move up to the next dimension. Now, the first next big step is that Trump has to win. Then we will move to another higher level. After that, we're going to have more problems because we still have to finish this cycle. So Trump isn't going to have it easy right away. In fact, we're going to have to continue to be very vigilant to make sure that up to the very end, we stay on the right timeline. And I'll give you an example of how that can go awry. Pretty much the bad guys that did the World Trade Center have been taken care of. But even as recently as about 10 years ago, we were still dealing with the Nazis. And there's still Nazis around. And the Nazis were trying to get us to switch to a timeline where they were like the man in the high tower, where they actually conquered the world. And we were Nazi USA. We were no longer United States of America. We were United States of whatever. And I know that for a fact we were still dealing with this because I had a problem waking up. And when I finally was able to pry my eyes open, I realized that my room had changed to having all sorts of really old 1940 furniture, and that I was like, oh my God, I'm in Nazi America. And I closed my eyes and fell right back down to sleep. And then it was like being in an altered state. I tried to open my eyes again, and thank God it was back in the USA. Then my eyes shut again, and the same thing happened. I opened them, and it was back in Nazi America. At which point I got really annoyed and said, that's it. I don't want to be here. I'm going to sleep. When I wake up, I'm going to stay in the United States, and that's it. And that's what happened. Sometimes you have to put your foot down. And that brings me to what I was doing in the 1980s. We were aware that there was a problem with the Nazis possibly winning the war, that they were doing everything they could using looking glass technology and using information from ETs to actually change the timeline so that they actually won. And so I was put into the mind of a woman who was the secretary of a rather famous general. And through her, I could see many, many things that they were actually up to that we in the 1980s did not necessarily know about. Partially because the Russians had a lot of information that we did not have. And also because we started to really understand that there were different timelines and that those could be used. And so I would go back in time to the 1940s. I would go inside the head of this woman, and then I would leave her body and I would go into the mind of a young man in the UK, where I would report through him what I had seen. And of course, obviously, what I reported could not be used necessarily on the spot because they would know that someone had figured out a way to monitor them. And or I would come back to the United States, where I would go into the mind of a Navy WAC in California. And she would go to several different places. And I would just kind of, with her permission, take over her body and report what I had seen and then give her back her body. That was my using it for good. There are people who know how to use it for bad. It's one of the reasons why we really need to stay on the positive timeline. Much safer, much nicer, much kinder. I'll give you an example, though, of markers that are branches for different paths in the future. And one example is very interesting because it's from Andrew Basiago. His name is spelled B-A-S as in Sam, I-A-G-O. When he was a child, he participated in time travel. He was sent back to Gettysburg, as people have talked about a lot, but he was also sent back to be at the Ford Theater for the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And he was sent there multiple times. And what he reports is that each time he went, he saw a different mix. It was the same people, but they would be in different places, doing different things. Even one time he went, he was actually able to get upstairs and see Lincoln through an opening in the door. And the point here is that he was creating multiple timelines. Another multiple timeline marker is John F. Kennedy's assassination. We see just the changes in his automobile as we compress the timelines. I remember with the first timeline that I noticed was the one that happened August 2nd in 2016. They always, as far as I can tell, they seem to always occur on solstices, equinoxes, and the days in between, which goes along with tradition of those being the days when one can cross over to other dimensions. So that makes sense. And the first one that happened was that all of a sudden, Governor Connolly and his wife were in jump seats facing Jack and Jackie. So this was no longer a four-seater car. It was now a four-seater car with two jump seats. Then with the next shift, which was with the autumnal equinox, the seats had changed and they had become full seats. And Governor Connolly and his wife were seated on these seats in between the front Secret Service driver and Jack and Jackie. And they were facing forward. Now, Governor Connolly and his wife were facing forward. And then the last change was the fact that there was now a second Secret Service man seated in the shotgun seat. So these changes happened as the timelines compressed and merged. The timelines are still merging. I'm still seeing these differences. And the differences that I see in timelines are not the simple ones like the changes in name on a can of something. I see changes in people, in power. I see changes in the masses and how they respond to people in power. That's a whole nother video. But that reminds me that the next video that I'm going to do is one where I'm going to show you a way to use time to help someone you care about a great deal who hates Trump, how to bring them to a space that is a very beautiful space, that if they want to, they can end up in that space realizing that Trump's a good person and being awake. But that's the next video. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you anon.